What happens when a security officer questions a quiet man's right to wear a simple cross around his neck without realizing that man is Jungkook? What began as a subtle act of judgment over a silver crucifix turned into a powerful moment that would shake an entire airport. And by the time it ended, no one would forget what he said or how he said it. The main hall of Incheon International Airport buzzed with its usual chaos. People rushed in every direction. Children pulled colorful rolling bags. Executives typed furiously on their smartphones while glancing at flight boards. Amid that frantic crowd, one man walked at a steady, almost unbothered pace. He wore a plain black t-shirt, worn-out jeans, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. No designer watch, no flashy accessories, no security entourage clearing the path. It was Jungkook. A few people gave him curious glances, uncertain. Could it be? Seemed to flicker in their eyes, but most didn't recognize him. He passed by like any other traveler, maybe even one who seemed slightly out of place in such a polished environment. One detail, however, stood out from his understated look. Around his neck, hanging loosely, a small silver crucifix glinted gently under the airport lights. It wasn't large or flashy, but it had presence. There was something about that piece, something heavier than its size. Jungkook moved forward without arrogance, without hiding, just being himself. When he reached the security checkpoint, he stepped into the line and handed his passport and boarding pass to the officer on duty. His name was printed clearly on the documents, but the officer, perfect uniform, sharp stance, trained gaze, hesitated for a second. Sir," the officer said, glancing from the ID to the man in front of him. "You'll need to step aside for a secondary screening." Jungkook didn't look surprised or offended. He simply replied with a calm smile, "Sure." The officer, whose badge read Kim, guided him to a cordoned-off area. She hadn't recognized him at first, his casual appearance, the worn sneakers, the complete lack of celebrity aura. It didn't match the profile she was used to dealing with. Even after confirming his identity, she hesitated. The silent bias had already surfaced. He let her do her job. He raised his arms, followed instructions, stood still as she waved the scanner. But her eyes kept drifting to the necklace. The crucifix. Now fully visible as he adjusted his bag, it caught a bit of light and seemed to glow faintly. She froze for a moment, her gaze locked on the tiny symbol. A flash of tension ran across her face. She said nothing but took a step forward, then another. She followed him with firm, almost rehearsed steps. Her expression had changed, more tense, more deliberate. Something inside her had shifted. She let him through, but then she hesitated again. "Sir," she began, lowering her voice just slightly, "we have certain policies regarding overt religious symbolism in shared public areas, especially in restricted zones. We ask for discretion." Jungkook turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, have I broken a rule?" Her voice remained soft, but the undertone sharpened. "It's not about rules. It's about creating a neutral environment. Some people might find certain symbols divisive." He looked down briefly at the crucifix. "I've flown and passed through checkpoints like this many times before. No one's ever had an issue." She hesitated. That wasn't the response she expected. "Yes, well, times are changing. Some people feel more sensitive these days. We just ask everyone to be considerate. Perhaps you could tuck it in." Her hand gestured vaguely toward the necklace, like she didn't want to point directly, as if the symbol might burn her fingers. Jungkook didn't react with anger, but he also didn't comply. "This crucifix isn't a fashion statement," he said gently. "It's not a provocation. It's part of who I am." Officer Kim forced a smile, the kind used to diffuse, not to connect. "Of course. And we respect that. We simply ask that personal expressions be kept discreet, especially in secured zones." Her words, dressed in policy, carried a passive-aggressive bite. A traveler nearby looked up, subtly tuning in. A man a few meters back shifted his phone, pretending to scroll but now watching. The air had changed. Something uncomfortable had started to bloom. Not loud, not chaotic, but palpable. Jungkook's voice remained even, controlled. "With all due respect," he said, "I believe I'm being singled out." Kim blinked. "Excuse me? If someone else wore a pendant of a tree, a star, or a stone, would you ask them to hide it?" She opened her mouth, closed it, reset. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" Silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she cleared her throat, stepped back with a nod and said, "I'll give you a moment." Jungkook looked up again, slower this time. "This necklace has saved my life more than once," he said quietly. "In war zones, in hospital rooms, in nights I thought I wouldn't wake from." His voice didn't rise, but it filled the space like thunder in a cathedral. "I won't hide it. Not now. Not ever." For the first time, Kim showed what she was feeling, her frustration, her disbelief. It cracked through the plastic of her trained expression. It was only a flicker, but everyone saw it. Travelers turned. A man lifted his phone from his lap, pointed the camera discreetly. Another whispered to his partner, "Is that really Jungkook?" But Jungkook didn't notice the shift. He wasn't trying to create one. He was simply standing still, holding a boundary others thought soft. Kim, sensing the loss of control, straightened again. "If you refuse," she said, "I'll have to escalate this to airport authorities." "You do what you need to do," he replied. His eyes met hers, calm but firm. "But know this, the problem isn't what's on my chest. It's what's in your eyes." A silence so complete fell over the security area, it might as well have been outer space. Even she stepped back slightly. Even she felt it, not just the power of the words, but the truth in them. She opened her mouth, closed it again. She had nothing to say, and everyone knew it. Jungkook's voice had been calm. "This necklace has saved my life more than once, and I won't hide it." Her professional mask cracked. Her irritation now fully visible. The hum of the airport continued. Announcements, footsteps, luggage rolling past. But one corner of the terminal buzzed with a different kind of energy. Jungkook stood quietly, the crucifix still visible, resting peacefully over his heart. Kim returned to her post, her steps quicker now. Her fingers tapped against the screen of her device. Her uniform felt tighter around the collar. She called out, "Min, I need you at checkpoint 2. The younger officer blinked. "Is everything okay?" Kim gave a tight smile that wasn't really a smile. "We have a situation. I'd prefer to handle it by protocol." Min followed, hesitantly. Back at the checkpoint, several travelers pretended to mind their business, but attention had shifted. One man continued to record, phone low. Kim returned to Jungkook's side, posture stiff. "Mr. Jain," she said louder now, finally using his full name. "If you continue to disregard instructions, we will have to involve airport authorities." Jungkook slowly turned his gaze to her. "For wearing a necklace? For refusing a direct request during a security screening?" The words sounded official, rehearsed, but they landed like a lie. More heads turned. Min spoke gently. "Maybe we should speak to the supervisor together before it goes that far." Kim shot her a disapproving look, but it was too late. The moment had shifted. Kim had tried to wield authority, but what she'd revealed instead was control slipping. 5 minutes later, Supervisor Park stepped out. Late 50s, weathered but kind. He walked over with calm purpose. "Sir," Kim said quickly, "we have a passenger refusing to comply with policy. I asked him to conceal a religious item that could disturb the atmosphere." Park listened, then turned to Min. "Your perspective?" "He didn't escalate," Min said. "He was respectful, just didn't want to hide the necklace." Park nodded, approached Jungkook. "Mr. Jeon," he said gently, "may I hear your version?" Jungkook looked up, calm. "She asked me to hide this." He touched the crucifix lightly. "Said it might make others uncomfortable." I said no. He paused. "This necklace has been part of my life for years. It's not a symbol of ideology, but of survival, of faith that held me together when nothing else did. I don't wear it to provoke. I wear it because it reminds me I'm still here." The space went still. Park listened, then asked, "Did he say anything disrespectful?" Kim said nothing. "Anything aggressive?" he asked Min. "No, seer." Park exhaled, turned to the crowd. "This airport is committed to respect, inclusivity, and the freedom to express one's faith without fear or shame." Everyone knew what it meant. Jungkook stood quietly. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't retaliated. And somehow, that hurt more. Kim stood in the back, phone vibrating in her pocket. She hadn't opened it. She didn't need to. The video was already viral. Her voice, her words. The moment she told Jungkook to hide his crucifix, all of it online. And for the first time, she felt shame not because of the backlash, but because she saw it now too. The moment played in her mind, not from her view, but from his. She hadn't been neutral. She had judged him quietly, politely, professionally, and that made it worse. A memory surfaced her grandmother's voice. Kindness isn't what you say. It's what you choose not to hide. 2 weeks later, in a modest apartment, Kim recorded a video. No uniform, just a t-shirt. In her hand, the small silver crucifix Jungkook had given her after that day. She looked into the lens. "I spent years believing professionalism meant hiding who I was," she said. She looked down at the cross. "But this reminded me what it means to be human." She smiled. "Thank you, Jungkook." And for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. 2 weeks had passed since that flight, and Officer Kim's life no longer felt like something she was simply walking through. It felt like something she was finally waking up in. The video she recorded in her apartment barefaced, holding the crucifix Jungkook had left behind, was never meant to be shared. At first, it sat quietly on her phone, watched only by her. Once. Twice. A dozen times. Each time, she thought about deleting it. Each time, she couldn't. But eventually, she posted it. No hashtags, no captions, no agenda, just truth. And that was enough. Within hours, comments flooded in, not from trolls or critics, but from people who understood. Flight attendants, office workers, students, security officers. People from every walk of life who had, at some point, chosen rules over humanity. People who had worn uniforms, not just of fabric, but of distance, of control, of fear. One woman wrote, "I work TSA in Boston. I've asked people to remove things I didn't understand. Today, I asked someone what it meant instead." Another read, "I'm not religious, but I cried watching this because I've hidden things, too, just different things." Even a former colleague from Kim's early training days sent a message. "You always followed the book. I admired that, but I admire this more." Kim didn't respond to every message. She couldn't. It was overwhelming. But she read every single one. She carried them with her, like invisible weights and unexpected gifts. The crucifix Jungkook had worn, now hers, hung quietly from a small hook by the window, catching sunlight in the early hours. She didn't wear it out of religious devotion. She wore it, sometimes, to remember what it felt like to face something bigger than rules, honesty. And Jungkook? She hadn't seen him since that day. She wasn't sure she ever would. But his impact remained not just on her, but on the passengers in that security line. On Min, the quiet young officer who now asked more questions and assumed less. On Park, the supervisor who started monthly debriefings not on policies, but on personal stories. On the airport, where a memo went out not long after. Security is not just about safety, it's about respect. No names were mentioned. But everyone who had been there knew what it was about. Somewhere across the city, Jungkook sat in a rehearsal studio, late at night, quietly strumming a guitar. The walls were padded, the lights dim. The only sound a low, steady melody that didn't quite form a song. Just rhythm, breath, space. His phone buzzed once, then again. A message from someone named Jeon. He didn't recognize the name. "I watched what happened. I wasn't there, but it felt like I was. I wore a cross in high school too. Not for religion, just for courage. Thank you." He smiled, barely, quietly, then set the phone down. He hadn't gone into that airport to change anyone's life. He had just wanted to get to his destination, to pass through, unnoticed, undisturbed, intact. But life had other plans. And sometimes, the most powerful things we do are the things we do by simply standing still. He looked at the guitar in his lap, plucked a few more strings. Still no song, just feeling. He had known the cross would draw attention. Eventually, he had worn it anyway. Not because he needed to prove anything, but because sometimes, not hiding is the loudest thing a person can do. Back in her apartment, Officer Kim no longer wore her badge as tightly. She still did her job, still followed protocol. But something inside her had loosened. She smiled more, paused more, asked instead of assumed. One morning, she found herself in front of her mirror, adjusting her collar like she used to, but this time, she stopped. She reached for the crucifix and let it show, just a little. She stepped outside into the bright morning light. The city was loud, as always. People moved past her quickly, with heads down and headphones in. She didn't know what the day would bring. Maybe nothing at all. But she carried a stillness now, the kind you earn not by being perfect, but by facing the moment when you weren't, and choosing to grow anyway. She thought of Jungkook again, not as a celebrity, but as a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't push back, didn't retaliate, and still, somehow, had changed everything. That's the thing about people like him. They don't arrive like thunder. They arrive like a whisper, one you hear long after they're gone. And that whisper says, don't hide. Not because the world is always ready, but because sometimes someone has to go first, and the rest, they find their courage in the silence that follows. Months passed. The airport eventually returned to its normal rhythm announcements, echoing across polished halls, wheels of luggage humming on linoleum, people rushing with earbuds in and eyes glazed over. But for those who had been there that day, the rhythm felt a little different now, a little more human. Officer Kim no longer worked at the same security post. After the incident, after the viral video, she was quietly offered a reassignment, not as punishment, but as protection. Too many eyes had recognized her. Too many whispered comments as she scanned IDs. Too many people pointing their phones without asking. So she accepted a transfer to the airport's training division. At first, it felt like exile. She missed the pace of live terminals, the unpredictability of the crowds. But over time, something shifted. She wasn't just enforcing policy now, she was helping shape it. Each week, she stood before a small group of new recruits, walking them through procedures, simulations, de-escalation tactics. But on the last day of every training cycle, she did something unexpected. She shared her story, not with slides or statistics, not with official memos or citations, just her voice, her presence. I once asked a man to hide a necklace, she would begin, hands clasped loosely in front of her. Not because he was breaking a rule, but because I was uncomfortable. Some of the trainees would lean in. Others looked away, unsure if they were supposed to feel inspired or uneasy. I did everything by the book, she continued, and I was still wrong. Then she would pause, letting that silence settle over the room like snowfall. And finally, the badge doesn't make you right. It makes you responsible. Learn the difference. Some wrote it down. Others carried it away quietly, tucked between folded uniforms and memorized procedures. She wasn't proud of the moment, but she was no longer ashamed of it either. That was Jungkook's gift. Not the necklace, the honesty. Far from the fluorescent lights of terminals and training rooms, Jungkook stood on stage in Tokyo. It was the final show of a short solo tour. Just him, his band, a stripped-down set of lights. No choreography, no fireworks, just raw music. The crowd was hushed in the last song. He wasn't singing. Not yet. Just letting the intro float, gentle piano chords echoing across the arena. And around his neck, beneath a loose black shirt, the silver chain glinted softly under the lights. He hadn't worn it on every show. Sometimes he tucked it away. Sometimes he left it behind. But tonight, he wore it. Fully visible. The same one that had sparked confrontation. The same one that had sparked change. And though he hadn't spoken publicly about the incident, hadn't posted about it, hadn't tweeted a single thing he didn't have to, people knew. People remembered. That was the strange thing about truth. It moved without needing permission. He sang the final verse, voice low and even. I won't be small so you can stay unshaken. I won't go quiet just to make it smooth. If silence is comfort built on fear, then noise is what I'll choose. When the song ended, he looked out at the crowd. No cheers yet, just quiet. Then applause rose, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that builds like a tide. One that comes not from hype but from recognition. And in the front row, a girl lifted a tiny silver crucifix into the air, not in protest, not in praise, just in resonance. Jungkook smiled, nodded once, and left the stage. Back in Seoul, Kim now wore the crucifix only on certain days. Not every day. Not as armor, not as a signal, but on days when she felt unsure, when she felt herself slipping back into the comfort of control, into the illusion that distance meant professionalism. She'd touch the metal lightly and remember his words. "The problem isn't what's on my chest, it's what's in your eyes." She never saw herself the same after that, and neither did others. Nicole, the young officer who had witnessed everything, was now one of the most requested screeners at her terminal. Calm, empathetic, thorough. She once told Kim over coffee, "That day taught me something you never get in training. When someone stands their ground without raising their voice, they're usually standing for more than just themselves." The ripple went further. A policy change was quietly introduced, no longer restricting visible symbols unless they posed a security threat. Not because Jungkook asked for it, but because people began to question what the rules were really for. The airport's HR director later admitted, "Sometimes it takes one person standing still to remind the system what motion is supposed to mean." And Jungkook? He never publicly addressed the moment again. He didn't need to. He kept wearing the cross not as a protest, not as a badge, but simply because it was his, because it had always been his, and because to him, staying true never required a statement, just presence. But every now and then, he'd receive letters folded and anonymous, left with hotel staff or slipped under green room doors. "I wore my grandmother's necklace again today. Thank you. I let my son wear his pendant to school without asking him to hide it. Your silence gave me permission to speak." He read them quietly, always. He never posted them, never replied. He just folded them, carefully, and tucked them into a worn journal with no title. A journal that said nothing on the cover but held dozens of lives between the pages. Because sometimes, what you carry in silence speaks louder than what you shout in spotlight. And somewhere in a quiet classroom, in an airport training center on the second floor of Terminal 3, a new officer asked nervously, "Ma'am, do we really have the authority to tell someone what to wear?" Kim looked at her, smiled gently, then reached into her shirt and pulled the chain into view. "No," she said. "We have the responsibility to understand why they wear it." And in that room, for the first time, the rules felt like something more than control. They felt like choice. They felt like change. And it all started with one man who didn't raise his voice, who didn't move, and still, somehow, made the world shift. Not by fighting, but by refusing to disappear. A year later, in the soft gray light of an early spring morning, Officer Kim stood at the edge of a lecture hall. Her hand hovered above a stack of name badges and folded attendance forms. The room was already half full, new hires, young and eager, some yawning behind their coffee cups, others flipping through printed manuals like they mattered. She didn't blame them. She'd once believed in manuals too. At exactly 9:00 a.m., she began. "Welcome to day one," she said, voice firm but not sharp. "You're not here to memorize rules. You're here to learn what happens when you mistake rules for truth." The trainees blinked. Some looked confused, but she didn't elaborate, not yet. They'd understand in time. Because Officer Kim didn't teach like other instructors. Her sessions weren't about procedure checklists and uniform standards. They were about judgment. Human judgment. The kind you're not trained to notice. The kind that slips beneath the surface of routine, until one day you find yourself asking someone to hide a part of themselves and you don't even know why. That day at the airport, it changed her. Yes, but what mattered more was how it had changed the people around her. In the months after the incident, an internal review was conducted not on Jungkook, but on airport procedure. There had been no formal complaint filed, no lawsuit threatened, but the viral video had raised questions no one could ignore. Why had it happened? Was it truly about security? Or had neutrality become another word for avoidance? A committee was formed. Not a flashy one. Quiet. Careful. A blend of HR, ethics consultants, and a few representatives from marginalized religious communities. The conclusion they came to wasn't printed in a press release, but it was shared internally. Cultural sensitivity cannot be reduced to silence. It must be built on the dignity of visibility. That line made its way into training materials, briefing guides, even recruitment sessions. It was small, subtle, but real. Meanwhile, Jungkook had moved on, at least on the outside. His music had evolved. Softer in some places, roar in others. Critics called it mature. Fans called it personal. Jungkook didn't call it anything. He just made what he felt, One of his songs, never officially linked to the incident, carried a lyric that fans couldn't stop quoting, somewhere between silence and grace. I found a place I wouldn't erase. It became an anthem of sorts. Not loud, not explosive, but held quietly in the hearts of people who had once felt asked to shrink. There were covers, fan art, stories, and eventually, there were letters. So many letters. One came from a father in Manila who wrote, "My daughter was stopped at her school gate for wearing a symbol on her wrist. She asked me why it made people nervous. I didn't know how to answer, but I showed her your video. We watched it together. She didn't cry. She just said, 'So I'm not alone.'" Another came from a retired flight attendant in Ontario. "I served celebrities for 32 years. Most expected special treatment. You expected nothing, but gave everything. I wish I'd seen it sooner." And another from a teenage boy in Hamburg. "I didn't think someone like you would understand what it means to feel ashamed of something you never chose. But I was wrong." Jungkook never replied. He never made a public statement, but he kept them, all of them. They lived in a weathered brown envelope in his studio drawer, alongside scribbled lyrics, old set lists, and voice memos that never became songs. It wasn't about collecting praise. It was about remembering the moment when silence became a mirror, and he refused to look away. Back in Seoul, something else had shifted. Kim had become a mentor, not just in training centers, but in the quiet moments between. New officers came to her with questions they were afraid to ask anyone else. What if I'm not sure what's appropriate? What if I freeze in the moment? What if I enforce a rule and realize later it was about me, not them? And she always said the same thing. Then you're already doing better than I did. Because the power wasn't in getting it right. The power was in facing it when you didn't. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year to the day after the incident, Kim received a package. No return label, no name. Just a small box with a note tucked inside. The note was handwritten. "I don't know if you still have it, but I thought you might like another. Not for your uniform, for you. J." Inside the box, a tiny silver pendant, shaped like a flame, not religious, not branded, just elegant, quiet. She held it in her palm and felt something rise in her chest. Not guilt, not shame, but recognition. The kind of recognition that says, you're still growing, and that's enough. Later that night, as the rain slid down the window in thin sheets, Kim sat with her tea and turned on one of Jungkook's performances from the Tokyo tour. She'd seen clips before, but never watched a full show. She didn't know what she expected, but what she found was someone deeply present, unpolished, honest, at peace. At one point in the performance, he paused between songs. The crowd was quiet, and he said softly, "Sometimes we go through places where people want us to shrink, and it's easy to do it. It feels safer. But then, one day, you choose not to. You stay still, and the world has to deal with the truth of who you are." The room exploded in applause, but Kim didn't clap. She just listened. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just a story about a necklace, or a misunderstanding, or even redemption. This was a story about the courage to stand still when the world expects you to step aside. About the quiet bravery of being fully visible without permission. And about what happens when someone meets that bravery not with fear, but with respect. Years from now, no one would remember the gate number, or the specific flight, or even the policy that caused it all. But they would remember a man who refused to hide, and a woman who stopped hiding because of it. And how, in a space designed to make people move faster, one moment of stillness rewrote everything. 3 years later, the story of the necklace had long stopped trending. The video had faded from the front pages of social media. New headlines came, new controversies, new viral moments. The internet had moved on. But some stories don't disappear. They settle quietly into culture, like seeds in the soil unseen, but still growing. And in places where people had once looked the other way, now they paused. Not always, not everyone, but enough. Enough to feel it. At Seoul International University, a guest lecture was being held in the Department of Ethics and Conflict Resolution. The auditorium lights were low. The audience a mix of law students, public service trainees, and community organizers. At the podium stood Officer Kim, no longer just an instructor, No longer the woman from that airport video. Now a consultant, a policy advisor, a speaker. She didn't talk about procedures anymore. She talked about presence, about how judgment rarely feels like judgment in the moment. It feels like routine, like order, like doing your job. I thought I was protecting the public, she told the room. But what I was really protecting was my fear of discomfort. No one interrupted, no one shuffled. They just listened. Everything I did was wrapped in professionalism, she continued, but it was really about control. It took a man who didn't flinch, who didn't raise his voice, didn't even ask for anything, to show me how deeply I had abandoned curiosity. She let the silence stretch. Then, you don't have to lose your authority to find your humanity. But you do have to ask yourself who taught you that one should always come at the cost of the other. Students wrote this down, not because they were told to, but because something inside them wanted to remember it. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Busan, Jungkook walked through a small community center that doubled as a youth music school. It wasn't fancy, just mismatched chairs, old speakers, and walls covered in hand-painted notes and lyric sheets from former students. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to listen. He had funded the renovation a year prior, quietly, under an anonymous donation through a foundation. But someone had recognized his name on a signed document. Word got out. Eventually, they invited him to visit. And here he was hood up, mask on, not because he was hiding, but because he didn't want the attention. He wanted to be invisible long enough to witness the space without distorting it. In a small practice room, a teenage boy played a melody on an old keyboard. Simple, clumsy, honest. When he looked up and saw Jungkook in the doorway, he froze. Jungkook pulled his mask down, smiled. "Don't stop," he said. The boy blinked, then looked down again. His fingers trembled slightly, but he kept playing. After a few bars, Jungkook stepped in and added his voice soft, humming along. No lyrics, just harmony. And for a few minutes, the room became a sanctuary. Not of fame or admiration, but of connection. Afterward, Jungkook sat with the boy on the floor, sipping from a shared can of soda. "Do you ever feel like what you love isn't allowed?" the boy asked. Jungkook didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "All the time. But I stopped asking for permission a long time ago." The boy nodded, looking at his own wrist, where a small, silver bracelet dangled. "It was my mother's. I used to hide it in school." Jungkook said nothing. He just nodded, offering presence instead of advice. The boy smiled. It was enough. Elsewhere, small echoes of that moment at the airport continued to surface. A public transport worker in Jakarta refused to reprimand a passenger for wearing a traditional head covering, despite pressure from a manager. When asked why, she said, "There's a story I saw years ago. I never forgot it." A teacher in Berlin asked her class to bring in symbols that mattered to them, not for show and tell, but to start a conversation about identity and respect. One girl brought a wooden cross. One brought a pride flag. One brought a photo of her father's tattoo. No one laughed. No one looked away. In a comment section under a news article about workplace discrimination, someone simply wrote, "The problem isn't what's on their chest, it's what's in your eyes." And dozens of people liked it without knowing where the quote came from. Back in her home, Kim opened her small wooden drawer and pulled out two pendants. The crucifix Jungkook had given her, and the flame-shaped one he'd sent later. She didn't wear them often, not anymore. They weren't charms or tools. They were reminders of the day she chose presence over pride, truth over habit. She had since become a quiet advocate within national policy forums, pushing for changes that weren't loud or radical, but deeply human. Rights to visible identity and public roles, inclusive uniform standards, empathy-based training frameworks. Some rolled their eyes, some called it softening security. She called it strengthening dignity. And she kept going, not because of guilt, but because when someone trusts you with the truth of who they are and you fail to protect it, you don't try to undo it. You try to honor it. And Jungkook? He continued his journey not as a symbol, not as a cause, but simply as a man who chose to be visible when it would have been easier not to be. He toured. He created. He stood still when it mattered. He moved forward when it was time. He never referred to the necklace story in public. But those close to him said something had shifted after it. He spoke more slowly. He listened more deeply. He smiled more easily, but his eyes, they held weight now. Like someone who had seen how fragile dignity could be and decided to carry it more carefully. And maybe that's the heart of it. This wasn't a story about conflict. It was a story about what happens when one person chooses to be seen and another chooses to see. And how sometimes, in the in-between, the world gets just a little more honest. Not fixed, not perfect, but better. One moment, one necklace, one stillness that echoed farther than anyone expected and continued to echo still. 5 years later, time, as always, had moved forward. Planes still took off. People still lined up at security checkpoints. Phones still buzzed with distractions. Algorithms still fed outrage and amusement in equal measure. But beneath it all, the quiet story of a man and a necklace, never shouted, never promoted, continued to be told in whispers, sometimes in classroom, sometimes in chapels, sometimes around kitchen tables late at night, and sometimes in places where no one expected to find stories at all. At a quiet bookshop tucked between two laundromats in Melbourne, a teenage girl stumbled across a slim paperback on a side table labeled Reflections. It had no bright cover, no famous endorsements, just a plain title in soft gold lettering, Stillness. When You Refuse to Shrink. She flipped it open. No author photo, no celebrity name. The prologue began with a single line. I once asked a man to hide his necklace, and in return, he showed me everything I had hidden from myself. She didn't recognize the name H. Kim printed beneath it, but something about it pulled her in. By the time she closed the final page, her hands trembled not from shock, but from recognition. The story didn't end with apology or resolution. It ended with a choice, a decision to stay awake. She bought 2 copies, one for herself, one for her mother. Half a world away, in a quiet corner of Jeju Island, Jungkook stepped into a small tea house owned by a retired calligrapher. No one there asked for selfies. The owner didn't mention music. The only question she asked was, would you like something warm or something grounding? He smiled and said, both, if that's possible. He was taking a break from touring. A rare stretch of weeks with no schedules, no cameras, just silence and sky and the quiet weight of reflection. For all the songs he'd written, all the stages he'd stood on, Jungkook had come to realize that the most profound moments of his life had happened not in the spotlight but in the pauses. That moment in the airport hadn't changed who he was, but it had crystallized something that had always been true. He was never meant to fit into quiet molds. He was meant to break them with stillness. That day, he hadn't planned on saying anything. He just refused to hide. And somehow, that had spoken louder than any anthem. Back in Seoul, a new generation of airport officers walked the bright corridors of the international terminal. Among them was a young man named Jeon, sharp and thoughtful, who wore a small wooden pendant his grandfather had carved decades ago. No one ever asked him to remove it, because 5 years ago, someone had, and everything had changed. Officer Kim now, Director Kim no longer wore a uniform. Her badge had been retired, her nameplate replaced by a simple plaque outside a door that read, Director of Integrity, Inclusion. Her role wasn't just to write policy, it was to ensure policy felt human. In her office sat a framed note, faded from sun but still legible. You faced it. That's more than most ever do. J. She looked at it every morning before the first meeting, not to remind herself of guilt, but of responsibility. Because the people she trained, the systems she helped rebuild, none of it could erase the moment that started it, but it could honor it. And it did. That fall, a quiet exhibit opened in a modest cultural center in Tokyo. Its theme, What We Choose Not to Hide. Inside were artifacts donated by people from all over the world, items once tucked away for fear of judgment. A girl's headscarf, a boy's pride pin, a man's wedding ring from a forbidden marriage, a silver necklace shaped like a crucifix, accompanied by a plaque that read, worn by someone who didn't raise his voice but made the world hear him anyway. No fanfare, no names, just presence. And then, one spring evening, Jungkook stood alone in his apartment, packing for a trip. Not a tour, not a work event, just a journey. In the corner of the room sat a worn notebook, the one filled with letters from strangers who had felt seen, understood, changed by something he hadn't even meant to make public. He added one more. It had arrived the day before, typed on thin paper, no return address. I'm not brave yet, but I'm watching people who are. You were one of them. Thank you for showing me what stillness looks like. He folded the letter, slid it into the envelope with the others, and closed the book. Then he reached for the crucifix, still silver, still a little scratched, still his, and placed it around his neck. Not because he needed it for strength, but because it reminded him of who he was when everything else asked him to be someone smaller. He turned off the light, opened the door, and stepped out, not with noise, not with fanfare, not to be seen, but to continue the quiet work of being visible in a world that still asked too many people to disappear. Somewhere, a mother told her daughter, "There's a story I want you to know. It's not about the necklace. It's about the choice not to hide." And the girl said, "Like me wearing my name in public?" And the mother smiled, exactly like that. Because in the end, it wasn't about policy, or airports, or headlines. It was about this. When one person chooses not to shrink, when one person holds their ground in stillness, it gives others permission to expand. And little by little, story by story, the world grows wider, and warmer, and truer. Ask ChatGPT. You said, continue with long. ChatGPT said, certainly. Here's the next long-form continuation of the narrative, further deepening the long-term impact of Jungkook's quiet courage and the ripple of change it left behind, told with emotional texture, reflective pacing, and generational reach. 10 years later, the story was no longer in headlines. It had been buried under the weight of a decade's worth of other news, global events, cultural shifts, crises, movements, and distractions. The internet had turned it into a footnote, a low-resolution clip archived in an old playlist titled Moments That Changed Things. But to the people who had lived it, who had felt it in their bones, it hadn't faded. It had settled like roots into the fabric of memory, into policy, into language, and into people. In a small sunlit classroom in Cape Town, a teacher stood at the front of a circle of students ages 12 to 14. On the wall behind her hung a simple poster with 7 words. Kindness isn't what you say, it's what you choose not to hide. The students were sharing stories. Not written assignments, not reports. Just stories. Moments where they felt the urge to disappear, and the moments they chose not to. One girl, in a soft hijab and cracked glasses, stood and said, "I used to tuck my scarf into my hoodie when I left the house. Now I don't, because someone once told me that being seen can be sacred." No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of space, but the silence was full, reverent, unshaken. Afterward, the teacher passed around a small laminated excerpt from a book long out of print. The excerpt told of a man, once mistaken for ordinary, once asked to hide a small silver necklace, and how he had calmly, silently refused. The students didn't know who Jungkook was. Most hadn't heard of the singer. The name was less important than the choice, because to them, it wasn't about celebrity. It was about visibility. Elsewhere, in a quiet cafe in Amsterdam, an older woman stirred her tea absent-mindedly. She had seen a silver cross around the neck of the young barista, half hidden beneath a navy apron. He wore it without concern, laughing gently with customers, his face calm and open. She smiled, and when he brought her the check, she said, "It's good to see someone wear what they believe without apology." The boy blinked, surprised. "My gran gave it to me. I used to take it off during work." "Why don't you anymore?" she asked. He shrugged. "I guess. I saw a story once. A man who didn't hide his. I remember thinking, maybe I could do that too." She didn't say anything right away. She just nodded and whispered, "You can," and left behind a note on the receipt that read, "Thank you for reminding me not to shrink." In Seoul, the training center had evolved. What began as a conventional security certification program had quietly transformed into something more, a global ethics hub, co-hosting seminars on inclusive policy, psychological safety, and conscious public service. It was respected, but not flashy, trusted, but not trendy. Director Kim, now semi-retired, sat on the advisory board. Her hair had silvered at the temples, her pace was slower, but her mind was sharper than ever. Once a year, she returned to teach a masterclass. Always the same title, The power of stillness in systems of noise. And always, near the end of the session, she reached into a drawer beneath the lectern and held up two pendants, the original crucifix Jungkook had worn, and the flame-shaped one he later sent her. She said nothing about them until the final minute. Then simply, we build systems to create safety, but don't ever let them erase the people they were built to protect. And in that room, every time, someone cried, usually silently, sometimes not. As for Jungkook, he had aged not in fame, but in grace. His voice had grown warmer, his presence quieter. He still sang, still wrote, but now he did so less from the stage and more from behind the scenes, producing, mentoring, writing for others. He rarely gave interviews, but on the 10th anniversary of the necklace incident, he agreed to sit down with a small podcast hosted by a former radio intern who had once quietly recorded a bootleg of his airport moment and never posted it. Instead, she'd kept it, protected it. She opened the conversation gently. "Do you ever think about that day?" Jungkook looked down for a long time, then smiled, slow, not sad, just still. "I think about it," he said. "But not because of what happened to me. I think about how easy it would have been to stay silent, to tuck it in and move on." He paused. "I don't know if I did anything brave. I just didn't leave myself behind." The host nodded, her voice suddenly rough. "There are people who say that one moment changed their life." Jungkook looked at her. "Softal." "It didn't change my life," he said. "It reminded me that I get to live it without shrinking." Then he added, "I didn't change the world. I just stayed in place long enough for the world to catch its breath." That same week, in a small town in the Philippines, a teenage boy stood in front of his class presentation. He wore a pendant over his school uniform, a silver flame. Someone snickered quietly. He didn't flinch. Instead, he said, "Sometimes we're taught to be smaller so others feel comfortable. But someone once stood still, and the world had to adjust. I think we can too." And just like that, the story lived again. No celebrity name, no trending hashtag. Just truth, passed down, and carried forward. Because in the end, what Jungkook gave wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even just resistance. It was a reminder. That dignity is not something we ask permission to wear. That identity does not need to be explained to be respected. And that stillness chosen in a world that demands conformity can echo louder than 1,000 voices. He did not become a monument. He became a mirror. And in that mirror, the world began to see itself more clearly. Not just as it was, but as it could be. One choice, one symbol, one man refusing to disappear, and millions quietly choosing to appear.